これからテーマに防災国土強靭化、国土のレジリエンスを高める防災戦略を始めます。ここではニューアーバンアジェンダの実現に向けた防災国土強靭化に関し、3社からご講演をいただきます。その後、モデレーターとスピーカーによる質疑とディスカッションを行いたいと思います。それでは、テーマ2のモデレーターを務めていただきます、アジア防災センター所長、中川正明様に進行をお願いしたいと思います。中川様、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you, Nodera-san. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all distinguished participants. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to the second session focusing on the resilient society through disaster risk reduction. I'm Masaki Nakagawa of Asian Disaster Reduction Center, which is an intergovernmental organization of its 31 member countries. So, first, let me briefly introduce the background and objectives of the session. So let me share some slides. Can you see the slides? Okay. So, as you know well, Asia is growing rapidly and requires massive new investments. For example, accounting for half of the 6 trillion in global infrastructure investment by 2030. And these investments could lead to the accumulation of vulnerabilities if disaster risk reduction, I'll say DRR after this. So DRR strategy is not appropriately taken into consideration. The World Bank estimates that the disaster losses due to vulnerable infrastructure has already reached to 520 billion annually. On the other hand, current large-scale investments underway in Asia can provide an excellent opportunity for us to mitigate the impact of future risks through proper planning. Okay. So objectives. So against this background, the session aims to discuss approaches and new tools for building resilient society in line with the international agreements, especially the new urban agenda, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. This session hopes to encourage countries in Asia and the Pacific to formulate and promote national, regional, or urban development plans that incorporate disaster risk reduction strategies. So today we have 3 lectures followed by discussion, bearing in mind the following 3 basic questions. First, what DRR strategies can be adopted by national and local governments to fundamentally reduce disaster damage and economic losses? Second, what are the elements of practical DRR strategies combined with other policies such as regional and urban development? And this question assumes that the promotion of DRR must be reflected in comprehensive policies such as urban development. And third, what lessons have been learned in the process of regional or urban development towards promotion of effective disaster risk reduction? So this third question focuses on implementation of DRR rather than the DRR strategy itself. Okay, so today we have 3 wonderful speakers, and let me introduce one by one. The first speaker is Professor Nishikawa Satoru, Disaster Mitigation Research Center of Nagoya University. So based on his rich experience in promoting DRR with the Japanese government and the United Nations as well, Professor Nishikawa will share Japan's DRR strategy of ensuring mid and long-term reduction of disaster damage and economic losses, which are essential for social welfare and sustainable economic growth. The second speaker is Mr. Hashiura Ryoichi, Senior Director, Disaster Resilient and Environmentally Friendly City Promotion Office, City of Sendai, Japan. As the fourth city of the third United Nations World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in 2015, which adopted the Sendai framework for DRR, the city of Sendai is taking a leading role in this initiative. So today, Mr. Hashiura will present specific examples of DRR strategies combined with other policies such as urban development, environmental protection, and renewable energy, among others. The last speaker is Mr. Ferdinando Aramo Tamrut, Chief Policy Development and Planning Section, Office of Civil Defense, the Government of the Philippines. The Philippines is now one of the leading countries in Asia in the promotion of DRR. Today, Mr. Tamruto will present a specific reconstruction projects in the Philippines, focusing on the challenges and lessons learned on land use planning and the community development in the relocation process. So, as this is a 60-minute event, without further ado, let me welcome our first speaker, Professor Nishikawa. So, Professor Nishikawa, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Okay, good. So, good afternoon, good morning to all the participants. My name is Satoru Nishikawa. Today, I would like to present the identification of risks to enable preventive investment, the Japanese experience. Okay, wait a minute, please. Mother Nature is not gentle in Japan. We have earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, typhoons, heavy monsoon rains, floods, landslides, and snow avalanches. We have approximately 18.5% of all the major earthquakes on the Earth. So Japan has a long tradition of coping with natural disasters. The oldest written record of an earthquake dates back to year 416, when the Yamata-Kochi earthquake happened. Also, the oldest written record of an earthquake tsunami dates back to year 684, the Hakuho Nankai Tonankai earthquake and tsunami. So in Japan, we have something like a culture of disasters. It was said that the most dreadful things historically in Japan for children are earthquakes, lightning and thunder, fire, and father. The father is no more dreadful, but this represents how the Japanese people have coped with various disasters. This is a traditional ukiyo-e drawing right after the 1855 October Ansei Edo earthquake. Edo is the old name of Tokyo. By this earthquake, Tokyo was totally destroyed. Most of the wooden houses were burnt down. And this picture represents how the ordinary citizens of Edo wanted to eliminate earthquakes. They believed that a monster catfish was the cause of earthquakes. Modern Japan is still full of tragedies and lessons learned. The 1896 Meiji Sanriku tsunami killed approximately 22,000 people. The 1923 Great Kanto earthquake destroyed Tokyo and killed approximately 105,000 people. This is a graph showing the statistics on casualties by natural disasters in Japan from 1945 to 2015. And you can see three epoch-making turning points. The first was, well, Japan is always hit by typhoons every year, especially right after the end of the World War II. The damage were very serious. And you can see that every time a major typhoon came, we lost thousands of lives. In 1947, Typhoon Kathleen inundated Tokyo. 1,930 people were killed by this typhoon and the flooding. The eastern half of Tokyo was totally inundated. And this was a wake-up call for flood protection of urban areas in post-World War II in Japan. So a series of new policies were formulated. And a big multi-purpose Yanagisawa Dam was constructed in the upstream of the Tone River. It started construction in 1959 and completed in 1967. And this is a multi-purpose dam aiming at flood control, agricultural water and urban water supply, and hydroelectricity. In Japan, we had a big population growth between 1945 and 1985. So this brought numerous social issues. Population growth meant demand for housing, water, food, electricity, and transportation, and others. So flood control, water resources development, hydroelectricity were the keys to social stability and economic development of Japan in the post-World War II era. Also, the great demand for housing, industrial development, farmland development meant that land deformation in urban areas and suburbs, and land development in coastal areas and mild-heat areas, and population growth and land deformation. If they are unplanned, they may induce disasters. In 1959, Nagoya was hit by a very strong typhoon, Isewan typhoon. This typhoon destroyed almost half of Nagoya and ended up in huge casualties. More than 5,000 people were killed. And this was the first epoch-making turning point for disaster reduction administration in Japan. And by this big damage, the Japanese government decided to change the approach to disasters from a response-oriented approach to a preventive approach, from an individual approach to a comprehensive multi-sectoral approach, and to invest for disaster reduction. Also, the three layers of government, the national government, prefecture government, and municipal governments were given responsibilities. 2 years after the Isewan typhoon, the Disaster Countermeasures Basic Act was formulated, and this enabled investment for disaster prevention. And also, it made institutionalization of disaster reduction investments. Also, on this occasion, the 1st of September was designated as the National Disaster Prevention Day. And thanks to these efforts, we had great success in decreasing typhoon and flood casualties. Also, Japan made investments for science and technology for disaster reduction. The highest and the most beautiful mountain in Japan is said to be Mount Fuji. And it was worshipped as a god in the historical days. But Japanese Meteorological Agency made a good argument that instead of worshiping Mount Fuji as a god, let's mount a meteorological radar for better typhoon tracking. And this was successful. Now, we also have earthquakes, so many earthquakes in Japan. And in 1995, the city of Kobe was hit by the great Hanshin Awaji earthquake. More than 6,000 people were killed. And this was the second epoch-making turning point for the Japanese DRR policies. There are so many lessons from this disaster. The first lesson is the collapse of old houses built before the 1981 building standard was the main cause of this. out of the 5,520 direct deaths, approximately 83% was immediately killed by building collapse. So it meant that in order to reduce the casualties, we have to do prevention mitigation, and we have to ensure building safety. But I would say that the biggest lesson was the lack of earthquake awareness in Kobe and Hyogo. The people, including the government officials in Kobe and Hyogo, erroneously thought that they will not experience earthquakes prior to January 1995. This map, the numbers, shows the number of earthquakes greater than JMA scale 3 felt 10 years before the earthquake. In Tokyo, we have 257. That means that in average, twice a month, you feel an earthquake in Tokyo. In Miyagi, it's 42. It means that in average, every 3 months, you feel an earthquake. But in Hyogo, it was only 7. So it was maybe it's human nature that people tend to forget about earthquakes. But the existence of active faults in Hyogo were known to only a limited number of scientists. There are 2 great faults in the Hyogo prefecture. The Rokko Awajishima active fault is a big fault which triggered a major earthquake in 1596. There was another one in the west, but this was known only to a limited number of scientists. So based on the lessons, there was a paradigm shift. After this earthquake, there was a call for a nationwide movement of disaster reduction actions. It's a combination of self-help action by individuals, families, and companies, mutual help action at neighborhoods and local communities, and public action by governments. Prior to the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami, scientists have told us that these are the possible sources of major tectonic earthquakes. And the Miyagi-ken-oki earthquake would happen with a 99% possibility within 30 years. This was a good cautioning from the scientists. So the people in the Tohoku area was rather prepared for a magnitude 8 class earthquake and tsunami. But what came was a magnitude 9 earthquake and tsunami. So the energy of a magnitude 9 earthquake is 32 times stronger than the magnitude 8 earthquake. So it ended up with an enormous destruction by the tsunami. There are so many lessons. We have to check what went wrong with the pre-disaster countermeasures. But at the same time, we have to check what went right with the pre-disaster countermeasures. It's no use crying over spilled milk, but we must make best of the lessons learned. In the Sendai framework, it's in priority 3. It states that investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. Now the challenge is how to make effective investment beforehand. Please take a look at these pictures. The upper picture is the Kobe earthquake. The lower picture is Sendai right after 2011. You can see that the below picture, no collapse of buildings in Sendai, business as usual inside right afterwards. Sendai City carefully examines the lessons learned of Kobe. The upper picture is a destroyed municipal city government building in Kobe after the 1995. The below is the Sendai City Hall. The Sendai City Hall was temporarily evacuated for safety check, and the safety was confirmed in 1 hour and resumed functions. Sendai City invested for disaster resilience. The Sendai City Hall was a very old building, but they had the chance to do the seismic retrofitting in 2007 to 2008. So when the magnitude 9 earthquake came, the Sendai City Hall was safe. Also, they have invested for the seismic retrofit of schools. And as you can see from these pictures, most of the city schools were checked for safety. And if they were found to be weak, they were retrofitted. So when the earthquake came, no structural damage to Sendai School, not a single child killed in the Sendai School. Now, the challenge is how can we take action before? We have past experiences, and with the modern science, we can appreciate the risk. And we can imagine a future disaster and tragedy. For example, what if your house collapse, school collapse, hospital collapse, bridge fall, or roadblock? That's a disaster. And if we can have these imaginations, and we have the knowledge of effective preventive methods, then we can invest and take action. In order to do this, the culture of prevention must prevail to encourage investment and action for safety and resilience. In Japan, there are various monuments of past disasters. The left is the Great Kanto Earthquake Monument in Tokyo. The right is the Tsunami Stone Monument in Miyako City. Why did our ancestors leave these historical assets for us? They did not want their descendants to suffer similarly. There is a famous proverb in Japan. It says that natural disasters will hit us by the time people have forgotten how to foster and inherit the culture of prevention. That is a big challenge. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Nishikawa. Recently, we have no time to forgotten disasters as we have more and more disasters. So anyway, thank you very much for providing us a comprehensive perspective in key initiatives in DRR based on the lessons learned in Japan. So through Professor Nishikawa's lectures, we now run the practical mitigation measures based on the engineering and empirical studies. So these policies and measures have been formed through the bitter experiences and trial and errors in Japanese history. And we also have learned how Japan can develop its DRR policies from just emergency response to the longer term mitigation and prevention strategies. So I thank again Professor Nishikawa very much. So now we move on to our next speaker, Mr. Hashiura Ryoichi from Sendai City. Please note that Mr. Hashiura will make a presentation in Japanese. So for English speakers, please use icon at the bottom of the screen to hear the presentation in English. Thank you. Mr. Hashiura, the floor is yours.
はい、よろしくお願いいたします。はい、よろしくお願いします。仙台市の橋浦でございます。音声届いておりますでしょうか。
はい、届いております。大丈夫です。
はい、では本日はこのような機会をいただきましてありがとうございます。私からは地方自治体の視点で震災からの経験と教訓を踏まえ進めております防災環境都市づくりにつきまして紹介させていただきます。まず本市の紹介をさせていただきたいと思います。仙台市人口109万人の東北地方唯一の政令指定都市でございます。都市と自然環境が調和した街並みが広がっておりまして、森の都と呼ばれております。東日本大震災では巨大地震と津波によりまして、本市は沿岸部を中心に大きな被害を受けました。この間、国内外の皆様から多くの温かいご支援をいただいたことを改めて厚く御礼を申し上げたいと思います。仙台防災枠組みが採択されました第3回国連防災世界会議は2015年に本市で開催されました。本市はここを進める中でこの仙台防災枠組みの考え方を実践するとともに 震災の経験や教訓を発信するなど、防災環境都市づくりに取り組んでおります。本市が防災環境都市づくりに取り組みに至った要因は、東日本大震災の経験と教訓を未来につなげていきたいという思いでございます。まず、私どもが学んだものの一つ、事前の備えの重要性でございます。この備えの積み重ねが被害の最小化、早期の復旧・復興につながったものと考えてございます。先ほども先生からご紹介があったように、本市では1978年に宮城県沖地震がございまして、ブロック塀の倒壊などで大きな被害を受け、ライフラインの耐震化など、学校の耐震化もそうですが、対策を進めておりました。津波こそ想定外でございましたけれども、事前の対策が復旧・復興の早期着手に直結したものと考えてございます。特に学校施設の耐震化、これは全国でも早期に取り組んでいたものでございます。学校の体育館は避難所として使用されるものになりますけれども、東日本大震災では多くの施設がこの耐震化工事のおかげで避難所機能をきちんと果たすことができました。橋梁等の構造物等につきましても同様でございます。未曾有の被害に見舞われた中でも、社会基盤が機能するように対策を講じておくことは、市民の暮らしを守る自治体として基本とすべき考えであると認識し、取り組んでいるところでございます。次に、関係者の皆様のご尽力もございまして、2015年には第3回国連世界防災会議が本市で開催され、2030年までの国際的な防災の指針となります仙台防災枠組みが採択されました。この中で重要な提言がいくつもあるのですが、本市で特に重要だと考えているのは、より良い復興、ビルドバックベターと多様なステークホルダーの参画でございます。災害前の状態に戻す復旧ではなく、機能面やコスト面でも、その時点で最も適切な状態にすることが重要で、我が国の災害復旧の補助制度もまだ完全に実現できていない部分だとは思いますけども、ビルドバックベターの考え方は今後の施策を進める上で基盤となるべき考えだと思っております。また、震災復興はたくさんの市民の力によって成し遂げられました。防災・減災の重要性を再認識し、活動を活発化し、広げた方々も多くいます。そうした仙台防災枠組みの考え方を実践し、都市の個性として生かしていくために取り組みを進めているところでございます。防災環境都市づくりは、まちづくり、人づくり、伝承の3つの柱で取り組みを進めております。本日はまちづくりについて重点的にご説明したいと思います。私どもでは自然の脅威を体感した経験を踏まえまして、完全に災害を防御することは難しいと考えておりまして、この後ご説明する津波対策の多重防御もそうですが、災害は起こりうるものと考え、津波の高さまで堤防を作るのではなく、防災林などの自然物も生かしながら避難時間を確保することで対応しようとする減災の考えを基本にしております。次からライフラインの強靭化、避難所のエネルギー対策、津波防災の取り組みをご説明いたします。まず、沿岸部の下水処理施設であります、南蒲生浄化センターの復旧についてです。下水施設はライフラインの重要施設ですが、電源を失っても機能するよう、最低限の処理を行い、自然放流できるルートを確保しました。これは震災前にはなかった機能で、太陽光発電の新規設置とともに、先ほどのビルドバックベターの考え方を具現化したもので、防災性や環境性を従来より向上して整備しているものでございます。 次に防災型太陽光発電システムの導入です。東日本大震災では、電気、ガス、ガソリン等の供給が途絶いたしまして、避難所の運営においてさまざまな不都合が生じました。こうした経験を踏まえ、198箇所ある指定避難所等に太陽光発電と蓄電池を組み合わせたシステムを設置しております。太陽光発電と蓄電池を切り替えて電気を確保し、停電が長期間続いても、防災無線ですとか、テレビ、情報通信機器、照明、コンセントの使用が可能となるものでございます。災害時において自律的に電源を確保するとともに、平常時にも二酸化炭素の削減が図られる災害に強く環境にも配慮したシステムとなっております。津波に対しましては、さまざまな方法を組み合わせて命を守る多重防御の考えのもと整備しております。自然の力はコントロールできないという学びがございました。被害を最小限に抑える減災の視点を意識いたしまして、海岸堤防やかさ上げ道路等の構造物で津波の勢いを減らしつつ、避難施設を活用した住民参加型訓練の実施など、コミュニティ防災の強化に取り組んでおります。ハード面だけではなく、津波警報があれば、即座に避難行動を取るなどのソフト面を組み合わせることが重要だと思っております。次に、中長期的な取り組みをご紹介いたします。本市では昨年4月から挑戦を続ける新たな森の都へを理念に掲げまして、仙台市基本計画をスタートしております。この計画では、防災環境まちづくりのさらなる展開といたしまして、人の手で育まれてきた森の都の豊かな環境を生かしたまちづくりをさらに進めることとしております。その事例といたしまして、沿岸部ではかつて豊富にあり、津波で失った海岸の防災林の再生を市民の手による植樹活動を中心に進めております。巨大堤防を整備するのではなく、これまでの施設の機能を拡充を図りまして、津波に備えております。次に都心部の例です。街路樹や公園などの緑を充実させるとともに、道路では透水性舗装を整備することで、雨水の浸透、貯水機能を高めております。本市は台風が多い地域でもございまして、ゲリラ豪雨に見舞われることも多いので、都市開発の中で失った保水力を取り戻す工夫は、これからも続けていかなければならないものと考えております。仙台市は海から山までつながる地形がございまして、市全体の約8割を豊富な緑が覆っております。これを守り育てることで、都市インフラの機能を高めまして、気候変動にも対応するグリーンインフラの活用を進めていくこととしております。今後も仙台防災枠組みの考え方を踏まえつつ、SDGs や気候変動対策も意識しながら、環境配慮の視点を織り込んだ災害に強いまちづくりなどを進めていきたいと思っております。引き続き震災の経験や教訓が風化しないよう、世界に向けて発信し、国際的に貢献をしてまいりたいと考えてございます。私からは以上でございます。
Okay, so thank you very much, Mr. Hashimura, for providing us a very clear and convincing examples of the importance of DRR from local government perspectives. So we now learn that the effective implementation of DRR it should be incorporated in various other policies such as urban development and environmental protection policies, and also provided as a comprehensive development policy of the region. So I thank again, Mr. Hashimura. So now I'm happy to introduce our last speaker, Mr. Ferdinando Aramo Tamaruto from the government of Philippines. So Mr. Tamaruto, the floor is yours.
Okay, so hello everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this opportunity to present the case study relative to spatial development and, of course, spatial development land use challenges in the context of a post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery. So the case study was based on a situation here in the northern part of the Philippines, particularly in the Cordillera Administrative Region. So the case study is divided into, the presentation is divided into 4 parts. First, I'll give a brief background and introduction about the case study, followed by a quick review of the post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery in the Philippine DRRM system. And we will try to zoom in into the situation of Itogon Benguet in northern Philippines for us to identify what are the spatial planning and land use challenges being identified and being experienced in the area as part of their post-disaster rehabilitation, and then some conclusions and recommendations that may help us further understand and rethink rethink relocation and spatial development as part of our post-disaster land use activities. So the Philippines is highly vulnerable to the impacts of natural hazards, and apparently in the World Risk Index report released last 2021, we were ranked 8th among all the countries with the highest risk worldwide. And in 2018, the Cordillera region in northern Luzon suffered the brunt of Typhoon Mangkut, the local name is Ompong, and um, that disaster or that hazard gave us torrential amount of rainfall that caused massive landslides, displacing communities in the affected areas. And as part now of the efforts of the community to rebuild and to recover from the impact of that disaster, the government has implemented land use policies such as no-build zones or the NBZs, and planned the relocation of communities to move away from those hazards, particularly from landslides. However, we have to take note that the implementation of these no-build zones or relocation has been highly criticized in the past years, particularly in the Philippines. Later on, we'll give you several instances wherein uh, relocation projects themselves are highly criticized due to the problems in the provision of other social services in the affected areas. And we also have to take note that these efforts in the past were often unsuccessful and actually aggravated the conditions of the affected communities. Now, the concept of building back better or building back better is increasingly emphasized, as we have known. It's one of the priorities of the Sendai framework for DRR. It's very emphasized in literature, in researches, in studies. Yet, adopting the concept is a very challenging because the post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery phase of a disaster may exacerbate various pre-existing disasters, as what is being shown by the case of this Itogon Benguet. So the case study actually explores post-disaster rehabilitation recovery policies in the region affected by recent disasters in the context of post-disaster spatial land use. Particularly, the case study looked into the policy framework of post-disaster rehabilitation related to land use, spatial development, and relocation. And the second one is how these post-disaster spatial land use policies, particularly the no-build zone policies implemented, affected the communities in Itogon Benguet. And from that case, or from that experience of those communities affected, we will try to identify what are the challenges of how these policies that are being cascaded to us from the international level down to the national and local met with challenges when being implemented at the local level. So just a quick review of the Philippine DRRM system. The Philippine DRRM system started pre-World War II, particularly with the creation of the Civilian Emergency Administration, and then it became the Civil Defense Act in 1954, related to the protection of civilian population during World War II, and of course the Cold War that followed after that. And then we have the Presidential Decree number 1566, which created the National Disaster Coordinating Council. However, in 2010, we had a paradigm shift in our DRRM system, wherein we now try to incorporate the concept of disaster risk reduction rather than just managing disasters. So the concept of disaster risk reduction and post-disaster rehabilitation recovery came into picture in 2010 with the signing of Republic Act 10121. Now, along with the paradigm shift that we have in the Philippines, 4 thematic areas were identified in our Philippine DRRM system. And this case study focuses primarily on disaster rehabilitation and recovery. And of course, along with the national mandate and of course the national policies that we have, our policies, particularly the national DRR plan, are also anchored on the priorities of the Sendai framework for DRR, for disaster risk reduction. Particularly, this case study is anchored on priority number 4, which is on build back better in recovery and rehabilitation. And of course, we also take into consideration here the New Urban Agenda, or the NUA, which provides us a very good correlation between good urbanization, land use, and of course, sustainable and long-term development. Now, what has happened in the Philippines in the past implementation of post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery? So the Philippine DRRM system was challenged as early as 2013 with consecutive disasters and overlapping disasters affecting the Philippines. We had, in 2013 alone, we experienced the Zamboanga siege, a human-induced disaster, the Bohol earthquake, and of course, Typhoon Haiyan, which affected many areas here in the Philippines. However, in the post-disaster rehabilitation phase, the following challenges were experienced in the post-disaster rehabilitation. There were funding gaps, ad hoc management, there were no standard templates in the preparation of rehabilitation plans. There is a reproduction of pre-disaster vulnerability, meaning we do not actually address the pre-disaster risks that have been identified in the affected areas. And of course, there is a protracted period of implementation in the implementation of projects relative to rehabilitation and recovery. So now, how this does relate to the case of Itogon Benguet in northern Philippines. So Itogon Benguet was one of the 13 municipalities in the province of Benguet, located in the northern part of the Philippines. And it's a very generally mountainous with deep valleys and steep slopes. And the main source of the area is on mining industry. So we have in the area, you can see a lot of combination of both large scale and small scale mining activities operating in the area. And we also have to take note that the area is one of the highest multi-ethnic constituencies in the province of Benguet in northern Philippines. What happened to this area? So Itogon Benguet in 2018 was among the most affected by Typhoon Mangkut, or local name Ompong, in September of 2018. So there were 2 overlapping crises during that time. First, there were 2 tropical cyclones affecting the Philippines that time, September 2018, and the impact of southwest monsoon in the area, which brought 794 millimeters of rain within 96-hour data, or 4-day data. The average monthly rainfall in the area is only 570 millimeters. However, within a span of short 4 days, the area received a total of 794 millimeters of rain. And that amount of rainfall caused massive landslides in the area. And one of the biggest landslides recorded in the area actually, in one of the landslides reported, there were around 91 small-scale miners and residents in the area who died in that single landslide incidents because their houses were buried in the landslide that affected the area. So these are some of the snapshots that we have gathered. This one was the landslide that affected Itogon Benguet. So as you can see, how massive the landslide is compared to the road, and of course compared to the houses that were built along the mountain slopes in Itogon Benguet. So again, there were around almost 100 miners died in this single landslide, one of the deadliest landslides ever recorded in the Philippines. And now, given the impact of that disaster in that community, we have to consider that disasters with major physical impact, such as that a landslide, may require a new land use framework to consider changes in the topography and, of course, the land use of the area after a disaster. So this has been happening in the Philippines over the past years. One example is in Tacloban City after Super Typhoon Yolanda or Haiyan in 2013. There were changes in the land use policy, particularly in the context of the coastal community, because of the possible hazards brought by storm surge. And now, given this landslide that happened in the Cordillera, there were also clamor in a clamor to review the land use policy that is being implemented in the area. So this alone laid down the urgent need to review the progress of post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery in the area for us to consider the factors in the implementation and review of a spatial and land use policy in the area. So after the disaster that happened in the area, the Philippine Mines and Geosciences Bureau conducted geohazard assessments in the affected areas. So after the conduct of that geohazard assessments, the recommendation was to declare some of the areas, particularly those located in many high risk areas, to be declared as no-build zones or NBZs, and they recommended the immediate relocation of the communities. Now, the declaration of these no-build zones are anchored in the comprehensive land use policy planning guidebook that is being used here in the Philippines, and of course, it is anchored on the Build Back Better principle that we want to implement. So in order for these communities to build back better, we have to remove them away from the hazard, or we have to remove them away from that landslide area into a safer area. And later on, as we can see, despite the implementation of that no-build zone, there are other overarching problems and vulnerability problems that we have to consider in the implementation of such post-disaster spatial policy. Okay, so after the recommendation of the Mines and Geosciences to declare some areas as no-build zones, the local government now issued administrative orders, creating demolition teams, and of course, creating an advisory to dismantle affected structures and houses that has been built in the area affected. However, after the demolition of those areas, the local government was not able to provide immediate relocation or safe relocation area because there were virtually no safe relocation area identified in the community, because the whole community is considered to be a landslide prone area. So they have not identified an area where the communities can actually relocate in a safer area. And so with that, the supposed to be no build zone areas that were initially identified were repopulated with poor quality housing in informal settlements that are still very highly vulnerable to the impacts of various hazards. So these are a snapshot or an aerial view of the area, affected area. As you can see, the massive landslide affecting the area and the number of houses and households and communities that are very vulnerable to the impact of these massive landslides in the area. So the purpose of the no-build zone policy as a land use policy implemented after the disaster was to prevent the scale of another disaster in the future. However, the immediate need for relocation sites and for reconstruction of houses should be prioritized. And despite its good intentions, the implementation of the no-build zone policy received disapproval from locals, knowing that the said policy was implemented without an approved plan or immediate relocation. So, alongside with that, there were also other problems identified in the implementation of such policy. Number one is that there is lack of legal provisions that will guide such relocation and post-disaster activity, particularly in such context. So there's a very limited description in the Philippine DRRM Act. While there is a law relative to urban development and housing that was passed way back 1992, such law was not designed for relocation and housing in the context of a post-disaster situation. Such law the law that was passed in 1999 was more on the relocation of urban poor who are living in railroad tracks, in garbage areas, in urban poor communities, in riverbanks. And it was not until the enactment of Republic Act 11201 in 2019 that the creation of Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development came into the picture that gave us an idea how should we go about with post-disaster relocation and urban development activities. Okay. Another thing that we have to consider in as an implication of the no-build zone policies is to ensure that the planned relocation should be carried out within a human rights-based framework, and that safeguards the civil, political, cultural, social, and economic rights of individuals and communities. So this was one of the experiences of the Typhoon Yolanda way back in 2013. And of course, another thing that we have to consider in the implementation of such policy is to ensure that livelihood improvement and restoration are considered in the relocation and in any post-disaster rehabilitation land spatial development that needs to be implemented. So more often than not, these are being neglected in relocation projects, which usually pay more attention to housing activities. Now, considering that in the area affected, there were around 3,513 families in that area who were displaced from their source of livelihood, because the main source of livelihood in the area is on small-scale mining. And with the stoppage of that small-scale mining and with the planned relocation of the communities, one thing that we have to consider as well is how can we ensure that we are able to give them proper livelihood for these 3,500 individuals. And of course, another big challenge in the implementation of that no-build zone policy is how can we ensure that the social relationship and of those communities affected will still be intact when they are transferred to a new relocation site in line with the no-build zone policy. So relocations can have a huge impact on relocated groups, cultural, social, and political aspects. Particularly earlier, I mentioned earlier that the area is very one of the most multi-ethnic groups that are located here in the northern Philippines. And removing people away from and communities away from their original settlements may mean their separation from their existing and pre-disaster institution and ways. Thus, relocation policy should also ensure culturally relevant structures that are to be included in the new relocation area. So the key here is to ensure the continuity of social coherence and identity in the relocation areas, and of course, in the construction process that will be implemented in the post-disaster rehabilitation area. And lastly, how do we ensure the inclusiveness of a post-disaster rehabilitation, particularly the involvement of the community? How can we make sure and how can we maximize that their indigenous socio-political systems and institutions are being carried out in the relocation process, and how can we make use of their local and indigenous knowledge in geophysical characteristics and history of the area to provide us guidance in the identification of suitable relocation sites for the affected communities, particularly in the case of Itogon Benguet. So as you can see, the case of Itogon in Northern Philippines provides us the idea of intersectionality in post-disaster management in the context of spatial land use and urban development. Number one is that vulnerability to disasters are influenced by a wide array of social factors, their gender, their class, their age and disability, their household, and so on and so forth. And second is, in responding and preparing for recovery, intersectional approaches recognize that people will have different needs, priorities, and capacities. And as such, we have to be guided by full understanding of differentiated needs rather than focusing solely on reducing existing vulnerabilities. So, what can we learn from the case of Itogon Benguet and the implementation of the no-build zone policy? Now, the importance of implementing land use and spatial development strategies, including relocation as a transformative disaster risk reduction and development strategy, with the assumption that relocation reduces vulnerability of communities. However, the case of Itogon Benguet provided us the other way. So we argued in our case study that the no-build zone policy and the relocation may not always be a good practice for post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery because such implementation does not always reduce the vulnerability of the communities simply by removing them away from the hazard-prone area. So it is not enough to assess and focus on one risk, for instance, the landslide. Attention should also be paid to a multiple risk and changing risk profiles, particularly risks that may emerge from their socio-economic, political, and cultural dimensions. Likewise, we also highlighted here in this case the need for a post-disaster rehabilitation and recovery and relocation activities to be context-specific. And of course, the idea and the importance of a pre-disaster recovery planning. So how should we rethink then and how should we understand a PDRR strategy and a PDRR strategy, particularly in ensuring that such a strategy will be sustainable in the long run towards the long-term urban development of the affected communities. Number one, it should never be sought without actual plans for the relocation of the affected communities and progress in the acquisition and social preparation for the victims. Number two is to recognize the impact and projected consequences related to housing and relocation. Such policies may produce unintended consequences and in the long term may even increase the existing economic and environmental weakness that turn natural hazards into a disaster. And lastly, in practice, there are distinct challenges that these policies should be able to consider, particularly in the limitation of land use and spatial development strategy for the region being a very susceptible to various hazards such as landslides. So that's the lessons that we can learn from the case of Itogon Benguet in implementing a post-disaster land use strategy and particularly in making sure that land use strategies are being taken into consideration whenever we implement these kind of strategies in the long run, not only here in the Philippines, but also in the greater Asia Pacific region and other areas that are being affected by such kind of disasters. Again, thank you very much to our host for this afternoon.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Tamaruto, for your very practical presentation based on the lessons learned in the Philippines. And Mr. Tamaruto's presentation reminds us that the concept of BBB, Build Back Better, in the textbook is correct, but it comes with a lot of difficulties in the practice. We have learned that policies on post-disaster rehabilitation and relocations should be context specific and not a one size fits all, considering the possibility of a multitude of risks emerging from socioeconomic and cultural dimensions. And also, we have a lot of opportunity to hear the success story or good examples, but less opportunity to hear the lessons learned. So the presentation was very precious and valuable. So I thank you again, Mr. Tamuruto. So also we don't, time is also running up, but can I have 5 more minutes now based on the 3 presentations? Let's move on to the discussion. So I'd like to ask the same question to the 3 speakers and have their perspectives from. So, okay. Okay, so here the question is, what are the gaps and challenges of the current development efforts that hinder DRR, people's well-being and sustainable economic growth in Asian countries? And then what adjustments or strengthening are needed and feasible to make these improvements? Okay, so Professor Nishikawa, would you give us your views first?
Okay. Thank you for the question. Well, I would like to emphasize that, especially with the population growth in the metropolitan areas, there is always a big demand for land use. And that means land deformation. And also the population growth means demand for water. And water, you have to have enough water for water supplies, but at the same time, you have to do the flood control. And that is a great challenge in spatial planning as well. So there, in order to control the metropolitan area's development, we have to always bear in mind the need for good spatial planning with due respect for disaster risk reduction. And that is a combination of investment and disaster risk reduction. And that is a big challenge for many of the metropolitan areas in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then Mr. Hashiura, could you share your views with us?
よろしいでしょうか。
はい、お願いします。
私どもは地方自治体ということで、市民一人一人に対して対応しているところでございますので、その際に防災の推進の中での課題といいますか、乗り越えるべきものというところでのお話をさせていただければと思います。やはりそうした観点で考えますと、一番はやはりその意識改革だと思ってございます。その市民一人一人が、いかにその災害を今後起きうるものとしてきちんと捉えて、今後に対応していくのか、事前の備え、西川先生からもお話しいただきましたけども、そういったようなのが一番やはり大事だと思います。どうしてもその人というのは今の段階、現段階での価値判断で、いろいろなものを捉えてしまいますけども、今後起きうる災害をいかに今想定して考えて備えていくか、これが一番大事で、これをいかにその意識を浸透させていくか、これが推進力になっていくものだと思っております。まさにそのいろいろな国際的な指針、パリ協定ですとか、SDGs、それから仙台防災枠組み、示されてございます。私どもとしては、これは地方自治体として、市民一人一人にいかに浸透させていくか、これを課題だと思って、推進していきたいと思っているところでございます。
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Tamuruto, could you share your views on this? Mr. Tamuruto, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. So probably one of the key lessons that we have to consider in this kind of situations is this very relevant in the particularly in the implementation of our priority areas identified in the Sendai framework, particularly priority number 4 on the building back better. Yes, while it is true that we have identified this as one of our overarching theme in disaster risk reduction and management and post-disaster rehabilitation, we have to consider as well how the implementation of these policies will later on be cascaded and be translated into actual action down to the local level. As you can see, the case of Itogon Benguet here in the Philippines, while it is a fact that they are trying to build back better from the impact of that disaster that has happened to them, there are other challenges that have to be considered, notwithstanding the fact that removing them away from the physical hazard will solve their problems. That's not the case in Itogon Benguet. Um, beyond identifying the physical hazard that affects the communities, it's also very important that we consider other sources of vulnerabilities that may affect. So we have to be very inclusive, and we have to have a very wide imagination, disaster imagination, for us to identify what really are the overarching problems that affect our communities. So it's not always about the physical hazards. Their vulnerabilities may come from their economic backgrounds. Their vulnerabilities may come on cultural background and so on and so forth. So those must all be considered whenever we plan for a disaster risk reduction management strategy. And again, we have to emphasize as well the importance of a pre-disaster recovery planning, meaning we do not only prepare for rehabilitation and recovery after the impact of that disaster, but rather we want to emphasize that even before the impact of a disaster, we now have the idea of a pre-disaster recovery planning for us to guide us how should we go about with recovery after the impact of a major disaster.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a three variety of different perspective on this. So this is worthy of in-depth discussion, but unfortunately, it's time to close the session. So I hope we have another opportunity to discuss these issues and explore the solutions. Okay, so thank you very much for a good discussion and the informative comments. So this concludes session 2. Thank you very much. And over to you, Onodera-san.